we will go ahead and start, and then if people trickle in, then great, and people can always watch the replay, which I'll send out after this is all said and done. But I just wanted to introduce myself for anyone that doesn't recognize me yet. My name is Alexis Wagoner, and I am the Marketing and Digital Education Director for Westar. And then I wanted to talk a minute about Westar because we do have so many people registered. I'm assuming that some of you may not be familiar with who we are and the work that we do, but basically our mission is bridging the gap between the scholarship of religion and culture and the public. And so that takes a lot of forms, but we are on one hand kind of a conglomeration of scholars who do a whole bunch of different types of work with a religious sort of bent, and we provide support for that work, both for individual scholars and for collaboration, and then with the goal of taking that work and packaging it for public consumption, if you will. So this being one perfect example, I think, of that work being done, of us bringing some of our scholars that have thought a lot about some of these culturally relevant topics to literally the public to dialogue together. So that's a little bit about what we do. You can always check us out at westarinstitute.org. And then before we kick things off, there is one other thing I wanted to mention, that this call tonight is the first in a series of Pride Month virtual events, and then that is kind of first in a batch of a new type of programming that we've been rolling out but are really starting to try and pick up the pace on. And these things will be available via our Patreon page. So we're launching a new opportunity for folks to be involved with the work that we do by supporting us on Patreon. And I will just put up a slide really quick here that has, let's see if, I don't know, I share it. I guess I'm not showing the screen, hang on. Anyway, it's okay. I can tell you the link. It's patreon.com/Westar. So that's patreon.com/Westar. And it's an opportunity, it's a place where we're providing more opportunities for anybody who wants to just pay a small little monthly fee of membership and have opportunities to do more things like this, to talk more with our scholars, to do Q&As, to do discussions. We've got one actually kicking off tomorrow. So I'm going to be talking tomorrow afternoon with another Westar scholar, David Wheeler-Reed, and we're going to have a more detailed discussion on queer identity and the Bible, and also work around specifically transgender identity in the Catholic community. So I'm excited about that. And then we've got a few other calls over the coming weeks with some of the scholars that we're talking with here tonight. I'm going to do one-on-one conversations with them, give more opportunities for you to, in a smaller group, talk with them one-on-one, ask some questions, have more of a discussion. And then that's just kind of the first bit of the launch. And then we've got the next thing that we have planned is probably looking into mid next month to be doing more content around our most recently released book, which is called Doing Theology in the Age of Trump. And we're going to be talking with contributors to that book about how we live good theology, what even is good theology in these trying times I think a lot of us find ourselves in. So we'll have some study guide opportunities, some study group opportunities. So it's just a little bit of a snapshot of what's coming up to people that sign up to be in this first round of patrons at patreon.com/Westar. So on to the main event. Kind of how we're planning on it to go is that I'll just briefly introduce our scholars that we have here tonight, and then give each of them an opportunity to talk individually about kind of some of the work that they're doing, and then they'll dialogue a little bit amongst themselves, and then I'll give you all an opportunity to ask questions and to dialogue with them, although I think we will probably just do that via chat. So if you have a question as we're going along, or when we come to the Q&A portion, feel free to type it in the chat box, and that'll probably be the most manageable way to do that. All right, so without further ado, first off, tonight we're joined by Dr. Brandy Daniels, who received her PhD from Vanderbilt University. She's a postdoctoral college fellow and lecturer with the New College Curriculum Engagement Program, and a faculty fellow in residence at the University of Virginia. Her current research project is a book manuscript entitled Who is the We? It explores the ways in which accounts and practices of formation in modern Christianity, and particularly within feminist theology, impact gender and sexual difference. Also with us is Dr. Uni Bowman, who got his PhD from the Graduate Theological Union and is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Florida International University in Miami. He's the author of Religion and Ecology, Developing a Planetary Ethic, among other titles. And then we have Dr. Jordan Miller, who has his PhD from Salve Regina University and is an independent scholar in Newport, Rhode Island. He's the author of Resisting Theology, Furious Hope, Secular Political Theology and Social Movements, which is out this year. So, Brandy, I'm going to address my first question to you, and I'm so interested to hear your brief take kind of on how we can dismantle the clobber passages, this terminology that is often used to refer to a few biblical passages, honestly, but have the passages that have become quite powerful to those who seek not to honor full inclusion of the LGBTQIA+ community. And then I'm also interested to hear your thoughts on kind of how to take that one step further and how you would say that queer theory opens up a different approach to think about these passages, Christianity, even religion as a whole. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks, Alexis. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Oh yeah, I bet you guys can't talk, so. I wish class was like this when I teach. Okay, so for what it's worth, Alexis did pose these questions beforehand, and she also said I have like 5 to 7 minutes. Oh, I'm gonna start my stopwatch. So I made a PowerPoint that I'm gonna run through really fast, and then I'm most excited about conversation with Jordan and Whitney, and then with all of you all. But here's my PowerPoint. Hopefully this works. Does that work? Can you guys see it? Can people nod? Okay, great. So basically, speedy plan, quickly going over clobber passages. 2, from there, talking about how they're kind of, and I can send this to Alexis and she can send it on to you because the last page is also just a list of resources. Apologetic strategies, and I'll explain what that means when we get there. And then talking about queer theory very briefly, which is kind of the end question Alexis posed, and then queer theology. So clobber passages, why is this in the middle? All of you guys are in like the middle of my screen. Okay, here we go, clobber passages. So basically, a lot of times when people talk about sexuality and religion, and particularly sexuality and Christianity, what they, and this is changing as time and time goes on, but especially when you hear conservatives talking about sexuality and religion, or why they say, you know, homosexuality is a sin. They're talking about basically one of like 7, 6, anywhere between 6 and 8 passages. I have them all listed here. I kind of grouped them, and I'm going to go over these really, really quick. Basically, there's the hospitality text, which is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then, you know, God burned Sodom, and people say, oh, it's because homosexuality. And Judges 19 is a similar story where that's even worse. I'll let y'all look it up. The holiness codes, which is kind of the most, they're the most intense of the codes, or of the anti-gay clobber texts. You know, they say you should not lie with a man, male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. Leviticus 20 says a man who sleeps with another man is an abomination and he should be executed, right? So those are pretty intense. Paul on Greek culture, so that's 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. And there, the kind of, the words there are malakois and arsenokoitai, and I'll come back to those in a minute. And so with these first 3, I want to note that, or I'll explain the fourth one first. So natural and unnatural, and that's Romans 1. God therefore turned them over to their unnatural desires, and, you know, Genesis. So of all these texts in terms of biblical scholarship, you know, you'll have conservatives of all stripes, or people who are anti-gay of all stripes, or who are committed to biblical inerrancy or infallibility, who will rely on all of these to say homosexuality is a sin. In terms of biblical scholarship, the texts that people refer to are really only Romans 1 and Genesis 1. The other texts, they're like, yeah, these don't quite fly. So the story in Sodom and Gomorrah, even the most conservative biblical scholarship, and not the most conservative, but most people are like, no, that's about hospitality. Same with Judges, holiness codes. You know, what do we do with the fact that we're not supposed to wear mixed fibers? We don't get on people for wearing polyester, right? Greek culture, I'll come back to that one in a hot second. And then, but natural and unnatural is kind of where it hinges. You'll see this a lot in terms of Catholic churches, or Catholic theology of, you know, this is not the way God ordered the world. So a lot of kind of early iterations of queer theology and LGBT theology have responded in these to these kind of passages in a variety of ways. I'm going to list them all right here. And these are what Lynn Tonstad in her book, Queer Theology, which is a great book and kind of a really accessible intro to queer theology, says as apologetic, is it going to let me? Oh, here we go. Yeah. Apologetic strategies. So she kind of lists and categorizes different kinds of apologetic strategies that folks arguing for the inclusion of same-sex couples or queer folks, LGBTQ folks, into the church use, right? So is God male, right? That's kind of one of the most primary ones. I won't go over all of these, but some of the ones that stand out. Argument from historical distance, that's the one that looks at the Pauline text and says, okay, our Synacortes and Malakoi, right? Where God says, or where, not God, Paul, kind of saying God, right? Speaking on behalf of God and the church, saying, you know, no homosexuals, idolaters, whatever, can enter the kingdom of heaven. What's going on there? That word is malakoi or synakoitai. Malakoi, basically what scholarship has shown us means like effeminate gay man or passive partner. And we don't quite know what a synakoitai means, but some scholars think it means basically like dirty old dude, right? The dudes who pay for the passive partners, right? And so some people argue that what Paul is doing there is critiquing something about male culture, gay male culture in Greek culture, not gay culture, Greek culture, that where young men were taken advantage of. So there's, again, historical, and that's not what we know homosexuality as today. Homosexuality, I should know this off the top of my head, I don't, but definitely was not around as a phrase in Greek, or as an idea, let alone a term in Greek culture, right? So we can't say homosexuality there. Gays aren't sinners, right? Like we're made in the image of God too, is a big one. The argument from beyond nature is, I think, one of the most interesting ones for me. And that's kind of like, oh gosh, it's already 5 minutes. Okay, we're gonna, but that one I think is really interesting. Gene Rogers in his book, Sex and the Christian Body, Their Way into the Triune God, says that God acts unnatural, and God acts unnatural. He makes this argument. The Bible says that God acts unnatural. In Romans, when Gentiles are, if we're not Jewish Christians, basically we're unnatural, right? So, and the text where Gentiles are grafted onto the body of Christ, the word there is the same word used in Romans 1 to condemn LGBT same-sex relations, right? It's these things are, God acted paraphysin, God acted unnaturally. So basically, apologetic strategies, and I can send some people a copy of this chapter if they want, but basically what Lynn Tonstad argues is that they have some value and they have some merit, but they're not enough. They reproduce some problems. And so she says what queer theology does and what queer theory does is give us a different lens of rather than trying to fit into a norm, of challenging the way and trying to, and there's a number of problems there, but I have like less than a minute. But basically, so queer theory developed kind of, I mean, when the term came about, and oh God, Teresa de Lauretis made the term, but basically it stems from work by Michel Foucault and Sigmund Freud as kind of its forefathers of kind of pointing out that sexuality has a history and a context. So, right, so sexuality isn't this inherent thing. It's not we're born this way. It's not God made me this way. It's no, even the categories we have to think about sexuality and to think about who we are contextual and historical, right? Homosexuality didn't become a term until whenever. Heterosexuality became a term even later, right? And why did it develop in opposition to homosexuality? What's going on there? Sexuality itself develops, is kind of Freud's thing of we develop as humans into sexualities. And both of them also point out that history and sexuality and context are shaped by power. So kind of one of the big things is that identity is socially constructed, and it's constructed often by power and operates in and through norms which often delimit and depress, right? So the norm is straight. So everyone who is not straight is gay. The norm is heteronormative, or to use a phrase that people use now, homonormative, right? So the version of homosexuality is basically just like heterosexuality. So here's what straight people are like, gay people should be like them, right? And in what ways does that delimit and depress people who don't fit into those norms? So queer is attending to those social constructions and challenging oppressive norms. I'm already out of time. Also, that's Billy Porter from a few nights ago from the Tonys. And I can send this to you guys, but basically one of the kind of four mothers of queer theology is Marcella Athos Reed. And basically she's saying theology should challenge this ideology that's normative and that works to oppress minorities and sexual difference. And she draws on a range of things like natural theology. She draws on critiques of like our fallen, like the fact that we're fallen, that we live sinful nature. So again, I'll send this to you guys. But basically it's shifting from defensive position of saying, here's the clobber passages, here's how they don't apply to us, or here's what the Bible's really saying, how do we use scripture and how do we engage with scripture and theology to critique and challenge systems that oppress and delimit, and it's a liberation theology position of like, God is for the poor and oppressed, and what does that mean? So, and then I'll send you guys this, but that's me. I'm like, sorry.
Thanks. No, you're good. I didn't mean to make you feel rushed, but thank you for packing so much in there, and we can definitely take more time and of it in Q&A as well. So, Whitney, I want to turn to you to talk about this interesting idea of how religious life, and you specifically talk about like kind of communities, it sounds like on the fringes, like cloistered communities, shamanic, other types of spiritual communities, have provided a way to transgress even what Brandy was saying a little bit, these heteronormative lifestyles. Yeah. Almost every global religious tradition talking about what you call third genders, third spirits, these cloistered communities. So I will let you delve more deeply into that.
Great, thank you so much. Great to be here with you all. And please let me know if you have problems hearing me, because my audio is going in and out for me on this end a little bit. So yeah, I just want to expand a little bit on, you know, what Brandy, you know, I think one of the big issues to deal with when we're talking about religion and queer theory is that on the one hand, you don't want to go back into the past and say, look, here's some identities that look like LGBTQ peoples, because that's sort of part of the point of queer studies is that, you know, these homosexuality, heterosexuality, all these things are constructed and they're not the same. You will not find the same in the past. And that goes male, female, what childhood means, what family means, all these sorts of things. So I think there's this tension in sort of teaching. I teach a religion and queer theory class, and I write some about it. But I think there's a tension in teaching, because on the one hand, you want to say, look, here's some queer identities. But on the other hand, you want to say, and that's not the same as what we think of now as homosexuality, heterosexuality, these sorts of things. So, so I just want to start by sort of saying, putting that out there on the table. But one person I think that has influenced a lot of early queer theorists, including people like Mark Jordan and these sorts of people, is John Boswell, who was one of the first people to sort of write about the history of same-sex marriage and these sorts of things. But he put this kind of well in one of his quotes, and this is getting into Christian theology here. He says, few Christian theologians before the 12th century made any references to falling in love. The phenomenon would seem to have been completely unknown to Jesus and his followers and the most of the church until the rise of courtly love in the 12th century. And of course, you know, John Boswell has been critiqued and all this, but this is just to say that something like what we think of as romantic love, where a newly constructive thing. So when we're looking back in the past, romantic love is not the thing that's guiding most marriages and these sorts of things. There are other concerns at play. But what I really want to focus on here is sort of the back context of queer identities and religious communities. And I think we have to think about sort of the problem of the ideal human for the Greek world, and also what was the ideal human behind the people that were writing the Hebrew Testament, the people that were writing the Christian Testament stories, and that ideal human, of course, were landowning males, right? And so when I mean, Brandy, you were talking about Paul. when Paul's making a critique of males, he's talking about landowning males. He's talking about landowning.
Whitney, you cut out for a sec.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Am I back now?
Yeah, you said he's talking about landowning males and then cut off.
Okay, sorry, where did I leave off?
Oh, you left landowning males.
Yes, so landowning males. Okay, so when we're talking about, Paul wasn't wasn't so concerned with what happened between landowning males and their own slaves or women and children. He was more concerned about what happened between landowning males when he was speaking. So I think that we have to always think about this context when we're looking back to biblical sources, and the context of patriarchy and the context of these sorts of things. And so, having said that, it's also the case, especially during the Middle Ages and the early Enlightenment, that, I mean, if we have to think about it, the ways in which religions actually help to support queer identities, if the expectation was, you're in, small town, what is now Germany, say, and you live within a 100-mile radius, and you have to become a productive member of society, which means you marry someone, have kids, and work on the farm and do these sorts of things. Obviously, there are not that many ways that you can get out of what we would call now a heterosexual sort of marriage. So of course, monastics, just in themselves, I mean, even the idea of celibacy is going against what we would now call heteronormativity. So monastic life, indeed, not just in Christianity, but in Buddhism, also has been a space for transgressions of heteronormativity and transgressions of a sort of heteronormative lifestyle. And you find this in letters back and forth between various monks and nuns also. And so I guess what I'm saying here is, yes, it's not the same as what we would call today homosexuality, because that didn't exist, but there are examples of same-sex relationships, same-sex love, and basically all the religious traditions. In most of the religious traditions, in most of the writings, not just in the monastics, but also in many of the mystical traditions. In Islamic Sufi poetry, there's a lot of literature about male-male love, for instance. So these things exist, and beyond that, you can find in almost every culture of the world more than, at least in the history, more than two genders. So you have third genders and fourth genders. And you have third spirits, they're called often, and sort of Native American communities. You find them in Indonesia, that you have the Waria, which are what we might call today, although it's not quite accurate, female to male persons. And then you have the Banshi and the Binchong, and there's all sorts of these examples in India and Pakistan of genders and sexes beyond gender and sexual dimorphism. And it's really a result of the colonization of monotheistic traditions that forces people into male and female, that forces this sexual dimorphism. And so in a lot of ways, we can think sort of monotheistic colonization for this sort of heteronormative compulsory that we find across many different traditions today as a result of colonization. So I don't know how I'm doing on time here, but I can keep talking, or we can just go on.
Yeah, I'll stop you there and let Jordan get in some thoughts. But thank you so much. Yes, that is all very interesting to talk about. And I think you hit on an interesting point about the dichotomy between wanting to look back and say, oh, but look, there was all these examples, but not trying to conflate that with the here and now as well, and doing that balance too. So we can certainly go into more detail on that. So first I will turn to Jordan. And I think, Jordan, I had you go third because I think what you talk about and what your work is around is kind of the natural continuation of some of these pieces of theory as you think about activism and how we can take a step further into that lived reality of what does this all mean. So I want to turn it over to you, to just talk about how these theories and ideas can affect our daily lives and the lives of community around us, and some of the work you've done around that.
Right. So I guess for me, the first thing is to clarify kind of why we're hosting these Zoom meetings this month. That basically why this is Pride and what Pride is about, where Pride comes from. And I think that the first important thing to recognize is this multiplicity that both Brandy and Whitney have started to talk about here within what we now call queer circles. This is the 50th anniversary of the first Pride event, which wasn't thought of as a Pride event at the time, but kind of became the foundation for Pride. In the 1950s, you got kind of the first gay activist organizations in the United States. There were two. There was a men's group and a women's group, both founded in California. The men's group was called the Mattachine Society. The women's group was called the Daughters of Bilitis. And they were basically social clubs that were focused on making homosexuality palatable to mainstream society. A major part of their work was to demonstrate that queer folks weren't threatening in any way, that they were, quote, normal, kind of just like straight people. The Mattachine Society had a march in front of the White House where about a dozen people joined. I believe this was in the early 60s. The whole purpose of that march was to appear as though they could just be government workers. They didn't want to appear kind of different or threatening in any way whatsoever. That, of course, prompted a reaction from a lot of queer folks of that generation who couldn't pass as straight, who couldn't or didn't want to present themselves that way, but wanted to affirm a different kind of identity. And a series of police raids and disruptions around the country started to cascade over the course of the 1960s. The final straw came in Lower Manhattan at a club called the Stonewall Inn, which was a mafia-run speakeasy, effectively, for queer folks and homeless kids. Normally, the police would tip the bar off that they were going to raid. They would raid. They would take all the alcohol. A truck parked down the street would be ready with replacement alcohol, and once the police were gone, the party would resume. There was kind of this public show of raiding the gay bars. But for whatever reason, in late June 1969, things didn't unfold that way. The raid happened much later at night than normal. And the folks gathered in the Stonewall Inn decided to start to push back. They didn't go peacefully into the paddy wagons like they might normally. They didn't produce identification cards like they might normally. One thing led to another, and basically a crowd gathered, trapped the police inside the inn, and a rather angry but celebratory party started outside. Once the police reinforcements arrived, bottles and coins were being thrown. There were reports maybe of bricks or stones being thrown as well. And it got referred to in the local press as the Stonewall Riot. Some of us refer to it as a rebellion instead. And it continued over the course of a few nights in late June. That event basically it allowed a number of people who wouldn't have otherwise been organizers and activists a kind of flashpoint to create new organizations and new forms of organizing, the most notable of which is the Gay Liberation Front, which formed in the weeks immediately following Stonewall. And that's the organization that held a parade from the Village up to Central Park 1 year later at the end of June in 1970. And that is what we call the first Pride Parade. It was on the first anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion. The important thing to note here, I think, for our discussion today is the fundamental disagreement within the LGBTQ community at the time between, on the one hand, demonstrating that homosexuality was not threatening, that it could be assimilated into mainstream society without any problems whatsoever, and on the other hand, a group of what were then called transvestites and homophiles who didn't want to assimilate into straight culture, who wanted to live a different way, and did want to threaten the status quo, that there was something about queer life that was meant to reject straight life, that was meant to be a threat to that. And that persists today. You saw this kind of dichotomy play out during the same-sex marriage debate that was happening over the last decade or so, ultimately leading to the Obergefell ruling by the Supreme Court a few years ago. There were a lot of radical queer folks who felt like focusing gay liberation on the gay marriage debate was a betrayal of what queer identity was supposed to be about, namely a rejection of looking like a traditional family, looking like a traditional kind of straight life. And so, you know, we have kind of throughout this history, whether we're talking about the biblical passages that Brandy began us with, or the kinds of queer negotiations that are going on in the communities that Whitney's talking about, or in contemporary activism, all along, LGBTQ, queer, homophile, whatever term we use that's historically appropriate, it's always a contested identity. It's never something that is just given as, this is what queer life is, or this is what a gay person is. There's always a negotiation going on, and it's often hotly contested. And that, you know, that is playing out today in terms of the corporate takeover of Pride events that we're seeing in many major cities this year. You're seeing police ask for parades, for instance. But if Stonewall began as a rebellion against the police, what does it mean now to have police marching in Pride, right? These debates are ongoing.
Can I add one note to what Jordan said?
Yeah, so I want to open up to you three to talk amongst yourselves for a few minutes before we open it up to everyone else. So yeah, Brandy, please.
It's a small note, but I think a fun one. One of the details Jordan left out in terms of what was going on during the Stonewall riot, rebellion, whatever you want to call it, is participants, like, there was lots of anger and brick throwing and stone throwing, rightfully so, and also lots of joy and cheer as the time went on. Like, chorus lines were a very like regular occurrence, and I just think that's fun to keep in mind. So get angry, throw bricks, and also dance. So
yeah.
Right. The one of the comments that you see in the Village Voice from the time is that before the rebellion really began, as the crowd was gathering, someone kind of satirically started to sing "We Shall Overcome." There was kind of a campy, farcical component to the whole thing as well, for sure.
So yeah, other thoughts from the three of you about each other's work, or just other things that you didn't get a chance to say that you'd like to continue on in that vein?
I don't have much else. I mean, I think I really appreciated both of what y'all had to say. And I mean, I'm excited to hear questions and whatnot. I have to leave directly at 7. So, but
okay.
I think they summed it up.
Great.
Our respective questions. Great.
I'd also just like to just add on the end there, because you know, this tension that that Jordan was talking about is like, it's palpable. And, you know, as somebody who writes about queer theory and teaches queer theory, but who has also took advantage of that marriage thing, I think it's important to talk about different audiences and stuff. So I try to say to my students, tongue in cheek, you know, be a hypocrite, you know, in the classroom, be like, you know, queer marriage, let's just abolish marriage and get rid of all this heteronormative stuff and everything. And who needs this institution of marriage done by the government, or, you know, make it, you know, a religious, whatever. And then on the streets be like, yes, gay marriage, right? Because it's the place where we are right now. So like, I think the audience matters. And it's just, I think the university and also religious communities provide us with a safe space to critique these larger things, while at the same time giving us energy to fight and the struggle where we are on the ground, and as a whole, you know, country or society, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think too, that was great point of, there's even kind of contestations within queer theoretical contexts about what queering is and what queering does, right? So two of the thinkers, I guess I only named one of them, but like Foucault and then Judith Butler, who is now an academic superstar with her book, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. So Butler talks about subversion as a kind of queer tactic, right? So to perform something with critical difference, right? And some folks will argue that something like gay marriage is a queering, is a subversion. And then there are others who say, no, like subversion reinforces the norm and entrenches it more deeply. What we need to do is resist and reject. And this comes out in lots of complex and convoluted ways in queer theory. There's, that I won't go into, but there's a whole kind of school of thought called the antisocial thesis that says like subversion is not what we should do. We need to reject societal norms and standards. We need to reject heteronormativity and homonormativity. We can't, subverting won't work. So these are debates that happen in, but I love how we, like, one of the things too of like, queer too tends to be read as more as a critique or as opposed to, and it all gets conflated, right? But as opposed to like LGBT studies, right? Like gay and lesbian study, and in academic disciplines, those are kind of seen as distinct fields, what queer theory or queer theology is doing and what LGBT studies are doing. LGBT is about like inclusion of lesbian and gay folks, and queer is about, again, critiquing the norm. How that happens and what that means gets really complicated, but
so I will invite people, if they want to type questions in the chat there, that will go to everyone. Well, I guess you could just send it to me if you wanted, but to everyone in the group, and then I can kind of filter them. And while you guys are getting started on that, I did have someone, I had a couple people send in questions to me just through email that I'm hoping to get to, but one of them I thought was kind of interesting, and I have wondered this myself, just, and you touched on it a little bit, but even just around the word queer, right? Because that has been a negative word for so long, and your point about like anything that you queer is to kind of like flip it. And so this person was saying, you know, I grew up in that generation that it was like hurtful. And to me, even though I think that person would identify as part of that community, from what I gathered from the email, they're saying that word to them is still hurtful. And there's been kind of this attempt at reclamation. So I'm wondering if you guys think what your thoughts on that are, if it's kind of maybe like a generational thing, or if that has come up in the academy as well.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan and Whitney can probably both speak to this better as activism, but like the Jordan's talk about the Gay Liberation Front, basically ACT UP came out of that, and their whole thing was like, oh, that they're the ones who came up with the phrase, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And they were doing this in the light of the AIDS crisis, and they're like, oh, wait, like this is, and it connects with the kind of queering as subversion, right? So taking something that's been used against you and inverting it and claiming it. But yeah, Jordan and Whitney might have more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about ACT UP is really important, that the AIDS crisis changed the trajectory of gay activism in a really significant way. And a lot of these debates surrounding words like queer or faggot, for instance, tend to be generational. You can kind of tell when a person came of age based on how they feel about those terms, and really the hinge or the turning point is AIDS activism, and specifically ACT UP in the late 80s and early 90s.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's you know, it's similar to taking a page out of feminist theory, and you know, feminist activism. You reclaim these words empower yourself, take them away from people that use them to hurt you. And you know, one of my favorite definitions of queer is the old English expression, queer as folk. It's basically you're just saying like, everybody is just as weird as everybody else, so stop talking about normative shit, you know? And so that's how I always try to present it to my students. It's not just a great old show on Showtime, but it's an old folk expression, and I think it's a great one that should be celebrated. Yeah.
Yeah. Brandy, I saw you respond briefly to Melody's question, but other thoughts too from the rest of us about just how helping students in this question, but anyone in general, really like respond to people that might kind of try to hit them over the head with the clobber text.
Yeah, I mean, I can send folks, and I'll put my email in the chat thing. There's so many resources out there about how to respond to clobber text. Reconciling Ministries has a good thing on homosexuality in the Bible. In terms of book, Jack Rogers' book, I don't even remember what it's called, but if you Google Jack Rogers homosexuality, it'll come up. It spends like pages responding to each clobber text. I think the big thing to keep in mind is that the only one that biblical scholars are like, this bears some weight and some similarity to homosexuality as we understand it today is Romans 1 and Genesis 1. And that's a more theological argument about what's natural and how do we deal with the natural. And, you know, and then some ways people can respond to that is like, you know, gay penguins exist, right? And there's plenty of ways to respond to that. In terms of Leviticus 2013, I am not a biblical scholar, I'm not an ancient Near Eastern scholar, so I don't recall the entire context of the holiness codes. But one of the ways that I can easily see the redemptiveness in ancient Near Eastern culture is the kinship models in those days. Like it was very, very patriarchal. And if you're a woman in that model, if your husband leaves you, you're screwed. You're done, right? So that's, you know, all the biblical things about like caring for the widow and the orphan, because otherwise they're SOL, right? So like one of the things about rejecting male same-sexual activity is like you don't want to abandon entire families because that would devastate the family and that would devastate the social structure, right? And in that context, right? So that's one reading, but again, there's so much stuff. Again, a quick Google of like Soul Force has great resources, Reconciling Ministries Network, Sojourners, and Jack Rogers' book. But again, I can send links to folks.
Go ahead.
I was just going to jump on there. My personal favorite for this is Walter Wink's pamphlet, Homosexuality in the Bible. And he does a similar thing, but it's not pages and pages. It's pretty brief, maybe a paragraph or two devoted to each passage. His conclusion in the end is that basically what the Bible means by these passages isn't really relevant to what we mean when we're talking about contemporary homosexual relationships in general. Even if it was directly relatable, the Bible seems pretty okay with misogyny. It seems pretty okay with slavery. Jesus says that you need to hate your family if you want to be his disciple. There are a number of really problematic things going on in Scripture. And if you really want to have a nuanced conversation about, especially what these New Testament verses are about, you need to have it within a much broader context surrounding kind of family and relationships in Scripture.
Yeah. I have a couple things real quick. I was just going to say, I know one of our scholars, Ellie Elliott, who I think is on the call, but I won't put her on the spot right now, but I'm going to put the link to her book in here. And she writes quite a bit about family codes and those sorts of questions. So that's a whole book, but she has also written other stuff and done some videos and things that you can find on our website as well if you Google, or if you go to our website and search her name. And then along those lines, I think David had sent me a question earlier. He's on the call right now, but I'll just go ahead and read what he had sent me earlier, or paraphrase it, around understanding the Bible better as a way to help sort of maybe mitigate some of these problems that we come up against with the clobber passages. And so I'm just interested to, I know you guys aren't inherently biblical scholars, but I know that some of this stuff just is the air that you breathe and the water that you swim in. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts around what are some thoughts about doing better biblical interpretation and maybe educating people around like a less literalistic way of reading scripture that could maybe get at some of the root causes versus dealing with just the bad interpretation or the bad application that we contend is happening with some of these passages too. Does that make sense?
I mean, I think being less literal is a good approach. I often find in classes that being more literal is a better approach. Kind of outdoing the fundamentalist on literal interpretation can really take the steam out of a lot of these conversations. You know, Brandy was quoting the Greek that Paul uses. A lot of fundamentalists don't know those terms, and so to really dive into the way in which those terms and concepts developed it can take the wind out of the sails of the clobbering.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think too, what texts are we engaging and how are we looking at the Bible as a whole? You know, someone else asked a question about unnatural and like, right? Like, and I mentioned this earlier, right? But in Romans, gosh, is it 8? Is it 11? I don't remember. But basically, again, God acts unnatural, right? Like, what do we do with that, right? So like, how do we read? Like, I'm a theologian, so I engage the Bible, but I use it in a different way than biblical scholars, right? But like, so how do we think of things like natural law, and again, what do we do with gay penguins, right? Or like a silly example, but a real one, a book out there called Evolution's Rainbow that talks about like, what do we do with the fact that heterosexuality isn't always natural for different species, and like, but it, you know, thinking of things too, like in light of thinking about things from theological categories, again, God acts contrary to nature. In light of the fall, we have limited access to God's, the way God intended things to be, and the way God intended things to be might be different also, right? Like resurrection, redemption isn't always a return to the original, right? So what do we do with that? How do we grapple with that? Right? What queer implications are there in that? What also even not having access to the original, and that because of our own sin. There's a great book that I had put that's in my PowerPoint. Jeffrey Reese's The Romance of Innocent Sexuality, and it uses like again the idea of the fall, and it engages with Saint Augustine of like, because like it's not, and this is a critique Lynn Thompson makes of the like gay is good, right? Like, sure, yes, absolutely. But also like, according to like a reformed theological sensibility, we're all bad, right? Like bad is the norm, right? So what do we do with that? How do we live, or to think about it eschatologically? And again, I can use scripture verses for all of these things. How do we live between the already and the not yet? What does it mean to live in the world now? What does God call us to? Thinking about Pentecost, right? We're in the season of Pentecost, right? Pentecost Sunday just happened, right? What Gene Rogers in his book, he talks about the way the fire comes in, and you know, you see the fruits of the Spirit, and people who the church people didn't think belonged in the church, God was like, no, they're part of the church too. They too have the gifts of the Spirit, right? What does it mean that gay and lesbian folks too bear the fruits of the Spirit? What do we do with that? How do we contend with Galatians 3:28 and Pentecost and whatnot? So it's, again, what texts are we using, and why and how to create a kind of theological vision? And I'll stop ranting.
Yeah. No, and I think you're absolutely right. And also, I mean, my whole area is religion and science, so I'll do the horrible academic thing now and bring it back to what my interests are and try to convince you why you should be interested. No, but one of the reasons I do that is because the history of religion and science, the history of the ways that you justify knowledge, right? So I know something is true, is usually boils down to it's God-given, or it's divine, or it's natural, it's in nature. And so when I start my religion and queer theory class out, okay, if this is the case, let's go back and look at the nature that's behind Pauline's, Paul's like scripture, Paul's writings. And that nature that is behind Paul's writings is a mixture of Aristotelian biology and Platonic cosmology, which said that matter and spirit cannot ever be mixed. And so there's nothing queerer than a God-man who goes around telling you to leave his family and roams around the desert with, you know, a bunch of other guys and some women, you know. So this is a very queer act itself, if what is natural says that spirit and matter can never be mixed together, right? That the true home of the unmoved mover is out there. So there could never be this God man on earth, right? So Christianity itself in its own way was a queering of the background Greek and Roman context and what they thought was natural and this sort of thing. So I think there's so many ways you can go about it. I think and they're all good, but it depends on, you know, what your students will respond to. But I think you have to come at it from all these different angles. Yeah.
I wanted to get to this question here a few minutes ago from Terry, who asked, how does queer theory and queer reading of biblical texts contribute to the greater conversation of sexual ethics? Kind of broadening it back out.
I missed that last part, sorry.
So, how does queer theory and queer reading of biblical texts contribute to the greater conversation of sexual ethics?
A ton. I almost responded via chat saying that, and I'm like, that's not helpful. But I think, again, Marcella, who Jordan just noted in the chat, of her work, Marcella Alphas Reed, again, I mentioned her very briefly. She kind of comes up with, she's working in the liberation theology tradition, and she's one of the earliest kind of theologians to draw on queer theory, puts it in conversation with liberation theology and with Marxism. And she proposes something she calls indecent theology, but basically she's saying that she's complicated to read, a warning on that front, but she's critiquing on theological grounds the way ideologies get taken. She calls it capital T theology, right? And the ways in which theology and the Bible get reinscribed in the norms to social norms and social context in ways that, again, are not, that are oppressive and limiting. And she says there's resources and theologies to chat like, and God is the liberating God, and the just God works to challenge those, and we participate in that. And she goes into lots of different details of what that means and how that's so, but yeah, I'll stop there for now, at least.
Any other thoughts on that? Okay, Perry just had a good point, which is, you know, we've got some great resources being mentioned, and we can certainly do an email to everybody after this and get you those, but I will also include them on our website, and I'm also putting a couple links here to stuff that we've already kind of aggregated on our site. So there's a Westar on the issues page, which has a bunch of different stuff, but among them is this LGBTQI piece, and then there's some other organizations that are from a variety of that cover a variety of topics that we've aggregated as well. So I just put those links in the chat, and then again, I'll try and compile everything that we've talked about and continue to update those pages too, so you can check that out for other questions. So let's see, I kind of got behind on the chat questions, but I don't know, do you guys have any other thoughts around anything that we've talked about today? Any other ways that we can think about engaging these topics, especially during this observation of the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, but just and going forward in our day-to-day lives?
I mean, I think, so I'll say a final thing because then I have to jet. But like, a lot of the questions were about the clobber passages, and I think that's great. And I think like knowing how to engage those is really important because they're one of the things that come up the most. But when we think about, you know, how many they're called people call them clobber passages. There's 6 or 8 at most, right? And if you're coming from a liberation theology perspective, right, one of the things that liberation theologians point out is that, you know, how many texts are there talking about the poor or the suffering? A lot more, right? So what does it mean to operate from that framework? And then and queer theory for me gives a lens to which that shows the deeply entrenched ways in which oppression can occur through social norms, and ways in which seeking liberation is possible, right? Again, like, and I love what Whitney and Jordan also spoke to a bit earlier about the kind of tension that's a tension that I think we need to hold, but also a both and, right? Challenge the ways in which norms are reinscribed. That, okay, why now queers can get married, but what happens to different kinship models where people aren't married and they want to visit their partner in the hospital, or right, or what about, and you know, and marriage stuff is now turning into a hot mess with international stuff going on, but also too trans rights, right? Oftentimes in the history of gay rights, trans folks have gotten thrown under the bus in lots of ways, right? What does it mean to think about gender as socially constructed, and what are the ways in which we sediment and naturalize gender have deeply hurt people. The folks subject to the most hate crimes are Black trans women. What do we do with that? And what does it mean to seek justice and liberation? And part of what that entails is kind of dismantling or deconstructing and challenging the norms, all the while working for those rights of those folks. That's what stands out to me. And I'm gonna sneak out now. Sorry, I didn't mean to like say my 2 cents and then peace out, but thank you guys.
Thank you.
Hi, Brandy.
Any closing thoughts from you both, Jordan or Whitney?
I would just say, like, you know, I think very similar to what Brandy was saying, that there's always, so for me, queer theory is about blurring all the boundaries and about opening up to the multiplicity of identities that are out there that you might not have considered. And that can be around race, it can be around gender, it can be around sex, it can be around what you thought nature was, right? Between humans and animals, between living and dead, between plants and biotic and abiotic, right? These are all like very blurry distinctions. I think one of Darwin's quotes that I like the most is basically like, evolution tells us that there aren't really species, you know, that it's all nomenclature. We're imposing these categories onto the world in a certain way. So I think that I think one of the ways that queer theory can interact with sort of liberation, more liberative and activism sort of strains of the LGBTQ movement is by saying, you know, okay, yes, and gay white males, you need to pay attention to Black trans women. Yes, and you know, lesbian feminist women, maybe you should think about whether or not you should exclude M to F women that want to be included as a part of your community. So I think that queer theory can do this, and I think it can help us keep open. I think there is a tension between intersectionality and queer theory a lot in some discourses, but I think for me, queer theory always has to be intersectional to begin with. So that's where I'll leave it.
I don't have anything else.
You don't have anything else? Okay. So yeah, thank you everybody for your time, for your questions. Like I said, I'll kind of try and compile some stuff and then send it out to the emails that I have for all of you guys for signing up, that you gave to sign up for the event. And as well as, don't forget about our Patreon page that we're launching, where we'll have more opportunities to chat one-on-one, but chat in a little bit of a smaller group and have a little bit more discussion time with some of our scholars, including the folks that you just heard from now. So that's patreon.com/Westar, and it's patreon.com/Westar. So thanks again for everyone who was on the call. Thanks Jordan and Winnie, and obviously Brandy for sharing your wisdom and expertise. And I look forward to talking with you again soon. So have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks. Cheers.